Let me start by saying good afternoon and thank you to all of you for joining us for today's webinar, which is Act 127, an update for school boards and superintendents. We are very happy to have you all with us today. Before we jump into things, I did want to share that this presentation is geared to the level of knowledge needed for school board members. Superintendents that are attending alongside board members will have the advantage of understanding the information that the board is receiving. Business managers in attendance should not anticipate the level of detail required for their job to be covered in this presentation. There will be some overlap in the content covered in this webinar with the content that was covered in the Budgeting to Support Student Needs workshop that happened at our 2023 VSBA-VSA annual conference. Superintendents and business managers are invited to register for the joint VSA and VASBO training for a deeper dive into the mechanics and planning related to Act 127 that will be held on December 4th and 5th. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Neil Odell, and I am the past president of the Vermont School Boards Association and also a current Norwich school board member. Perfect. Yes, I was going to say go to the next slide. So today we are going to cover three things. First, we're going to review the roles and responsibilities of school boards and superintendents in the budgeting process. Next, we will consider potential FY25 fiscal pressures impacting school districts with a focus on Act 127. And then finally, hope that you will leave with an understanding of the mechanics and the vocabulary of the updated education funding system in Vermont. Go on to the next slide. We will begin with a brief overview of roles and responsibilities of the school board in budgeting, briefly discuss some current fiscal pressures for FY25, and cover the background and high-level mechanics of Act 127. We'll leave plenty of time for discussion at the end of the session. Today, we are joined by Morgan Daybell, President of the Vermont Association of School Business Officials. Morgan, if you just want to say hi to folks.
Hello, everyone.
Thanks. Also, Bill Kimball, Superintendent of the Maple Run Unified School District. Bill?
Hello, all. Welcome.
Thank you. Next up is Brad James, Education Finance Manager with the Agency of Education.
Hi, folks.
And Nicole Lee, Education Finance Manager, also with the Agency of Education.
Good afternoon, everyone.
Vermont Superintendents Association Executive Director, Jeff Francis.
Good afternoon, everyone.
And Associate Executive Director, Chelsea Myers, also with the VSA, and she will serve as moderator for the question and answer segments. Chelsea?
Hi, everyone.
All right, move on to slide 5. We are all well aware that financial resources are needed to support the delivery of education. Without adequate resources approved by the community, the mission of the education system cannot be fulfilled. School boards have an important role in assuring the education system has sufficient resources to achieve its mission. First, school boards adopt a budget that supports the district's mission. Secondly, the board provides high-level financial oversight to ensure that resources are properly managed on behalf of taxpayers. Budget development, adoption, and passage is really a team effort. There's an annual budget cycle with each party playing a different yet equally important role, as this diagram shows. Passing a budget, especially in difficult circumstances, requires strong communication and collaboration among the board, the administration, and the voters. Starting in late summer, early fall, the board presents budget parameters to guide the administration in its development of the budget. Later in the fall, the administration presents a draft budget to the board for its review and feedback. At this point, there's likely to be an iterative process in modifying and ultimately finalizing the budget, which then gets adopted by the board sometime late in the calendar year or early in the following one. The board then presents the proposed budget to the electorate with the rationale for how it complies with district priorities and board policies with the aim of getting it passed. The board is responsible for assuring that the final budget will meet the needs of the district, is fiscally responsible, and is defensible to the community. It meets this important responsibility by doing what is outlined here. This is the board's role in the budgeting process. While the whole process can seem overwhelming, especially to a new board member, it really all boils down to this. Remember, passing a budget is a team effort with each party playing a different and equally important role. When the board is presented with the budget for the first time, which in many cases is happening this month, here are some questions for members to ask the administrative team. As a board member, do your best at staying at that higher level and keeping the big picture in mind. Use these questions to help you make the connection between the budget and the vision, mission, and priorities of the district or supervisory union. For the finer details of the budget, you have great expertise in the district office staff, the superintendent and business manager to help you. They are the experts on all things budget and finance, so rely on those folks for support. And I believe I'm going to turn it over to Chelsea.
Yes. As Neil stated, the focus today will be on Act 127, but it would be remiss of us to not talk a little bit about the other contextual factors that are influencing budgets in the FY25 budgeting cycle. So we'll briefly talk about federal relief funds, otherwise known as the ESSER cliff, inflation, which is impacting all elements of society right now, declining enrollments, which may impact some of you and not others. We do see some areas of the state that have increasing enrollments. And then Jeff will talk briefly about school facilities, and then we'll dive into Act 127 with Morgan Daybell and Brad James and Nicole Lee. So districts have had an unprecedented influx of federal funding, but that will end in September 2024. So this is the first time in several years that you will not be budgeting with that increase of federal funding for the FY25 budgeting cycle. Districts that have used ESSER for recurring financial commitments will likely experience greater budgetary challenges after September 2024. Edunomics is a great resource that talks about budgeting from a higher level and trends seen nationally that do have an impact on Vermont as well. So I highly recommend checking out Edunomics. So districts that have spent ESSER funds on recurring financial commitments, such as hiring new employees, salary increases, new technologies that require annual fees, will have to start thinking about whether they plan to continue those services, and if so, how are they communicating with the community about absorbing some of those costs into the local budgets. The increased challenges associated with the pandemic, such as mental health and learning recovery, will likely persist when funds run out. We're still seeing the impacts of the pandemic, particularly in the way of mental health. And those funds will no longer be available to support additional resources for addressing those challenges. Inflation is playing a role, as I said, on all elements of society. The rising cost of non-labor plays a smaller role, such as increase in fuel, utilities, food, and maintenance costs. But the proportionally larger impact in the role of inflation is in contract negotiation. Just like everyone else, educators are feeling the cost of higher cost of living, and that's impacting the way that negotiations are playing out. Healthcare bargaining, we've seen recently has come out that there will be between a 16 and 17% increase in healthcare costs. Please correct me if I'm wrong on that number, Morgan. I'll pause just in case because I don't want to give the wrong number, but I'm pretty sure that's it. Or Brad,
You're
give me a
right.
thumbs up. All right.
16.4.
All right. I thought it was somewhere around there. Labor market scarcity also drives wages up as well, and there's competition between districts. And as we know, there is concerns for statewide equity when it comes to teacher shortages and the availability of qualified staff in different regions of the state. And families during times of economic uncertainty are going to turn to school districts for more services that might not traditionally be thought of in the education realm. As I said, some of you are potentially experiencing declining enrollment, while others are actually experiencing increasing enrollment. Federal funds may have masked the longer impacts of declining enrollments, and that's a trend seen nationally. Staff to student ratios may have also decreased in addition to relief funds. So adding more staff while enrollments are declining. And then staff to student ratios are impacted by increased student needs. So again, adding more staff to support the increased needs of your students would have potentially decreased the staff to student ratio, and all plays a factor when you're thinking about budgeting and the cost of sustaining your schools and the level of services that they're providing for students. Jeff, on to you.
Looming large in the budgeting process this year are the costs of capital maintenance and remediation of school facilities that are in need of improvement. In December 2022, Tax Commissioner Bolio in the December 1st letter pointed specifically to capital maintenance and remediation as key cost drivers presently and certainly into the future. As I think everyone on the call is probably aware, there's been no state capital construction aid since 2007. The Agency of Education right now is leading a process, having completed school facilities assessments for all school facilities in Vermont. Districts are now seeing the results of those schools facility assessment. And I think probably learning what they already knew, which is that our school facilities in Vermont are in need of major capital investment for the most part. The General Assembly is responding to this need through Act 72 and most recently the assemblage of a school construction aid task force, which is co-chaired by the state treasurer and the AOE secretary. But there's no immediate relief on the horizon with respect to state resources for improving school facilities. We know now, because of some recent projects in Vermont, both that modern facilities, when they are available, do have a profound impact on the learning process in schools. We also know that pressure is being brought to bear, particularly in recent years, around environmental concerns for school facilities. In recent years, we've seen initiatives to address lead in water in schools, radon that may be affecting schools, and in a very dramatic way, PCB requirements for remediation and mitigation. We also know that with the interest in improving school safety, there will be prospects for requiring new investment to make buildings more safe and secure. So in summary, in addition to all the factors that Chelsea cited, we have a looming challenge with school facilities that is affecting most, if not all, school districts in Vermont. Now we're going to shift to the Act 127 presentation specifically, and we thought that it was appropriate to start with a high-level presentation on the why for Act 127. These are factors and information that I imagine are known to most of you, but we're going to just quickly go through the why. In Vermont, we have a constitutional requirement for equal access to funding of education. Weighting is the method that state policymakers have established to ensure that access. Pupil weights adjust student counts to support educating students with different needs or circumstances. Act 60 weights were not empirically derived, and in recent years, the General Assembly decided to make an adjustment to those weights, thus Act 127. Act 127 does have an empirical basis, and it was passed by the General Assembly to correct the deficiency of non-empirically derived weights and also update our weights for different classifications and needs of students. The effects of the adjustments to these weights are being addressed by a phased-in approach to implementation over the next 5 years. Now, Morgan, or I guess Brad and Nicole are going to delve into this topic more deeply.
Oh, Brad, you're muted there, buddy.
Got it. Thank you. There, better. So I'm going to follow Jeff and kind of keep this at a higher level and not delve into the weeds so we get to the questions, which probably will go that way. But basically, there are a lot of words on this slide, but on the right-hand side are the new weights under Act 127. The basic what they did is, as Jeff said, they came up with new categories. They split secondary, which used to be 7, 8, into a middle and secondary, made middle 6 and 8, and secondary is 9, 12. They increased power from 0.25 weight to 1.03, so that's basically a 4-fold increase. And they increased the English language learner weight from 0.2 to 2.49, 1,200% increase. They realized that there was issues with rural districts, so they came up with a sparsity calculations depending on how, and they were looking at how things changed, given how sparse you are. And sparsity was defined as the total population of a town per square mile land area. So it's not your student count, it's actually the town population, so it's census population. And then small schools, they realized that there were some that they needed some weights in regards to that. And that's based on their enrollment counts, but you have to be a sparse small school to get this weight. You have to be in a district that has an aggregate sparsity of 55 people or less per square mile. So these are the new weights. They've changed significantly, and they've been dramatically increased, I guess is probably the best way to put it. So the idea behind this is that for a given level of spending, a district that is advantaged, in other words, their count is now higher than it would have been under the old system, is going to have an increased taxing capacity. That will do, and that's going to happen because they're basically what they're doing is they're lowering their spending per pupil, and therefore a lower tax rate is going to result. That's the taxing capacity. So what should be able to happen is that the school district should be able to spend more money and up to that old tax rate. So you're getting basically more money for your tax rate for all practical purposes, and apply that money to increase services for those students. And how those increases are done, I don't know. In a lot of cases, I know that it will be going to faculty because a lot of faculty are underpaid in some of our districts, or not paid as well as was mentioned earlier. But the third bullet is kind of important. The intent was not to give districts a tax break, not to take that taxing capacity as a tax break. The idea is to provide capacity for them to raise more money for these kids who need the services, who generated that tax capacity. So it may be that you can spend a significant amount more and still get a bit of a tax rate for the taxpayers, but that remains to be seen. And then for those districts who are disadvantaged, i.e., their equivalent pupil count is less than what it was before, in order to spend the same amount of money per pupil, they're going to have a higher tax rate. So there's pressure on them to decrease their spending. And again, this is all going back to what Jeff was saying, is that the original weights were not empirically derived, whereas these new weights are. Next slide, please, Carrie. So things to remember that are different. We used to use equalized pupil. One of the things that we talked about earlier on was mentioning the tax rate. Your tax rate is based on your spending per pupil, and technically it's based on current law right now. It's based on education spending per equalized pupil. We will not be using equalized pupils starting next school year. We will be using the long-term weighted ADM, which is the step right before equalized pupils. So everybody's pupil count is going to increase because of the increased weights. The weights are very significant, but we're changing that. So that automatically is going to decrease the spending per pupil. And then that will be adjusted by the yield, because we still have to bring the right amount of money into the education fund from education property taxes. Those districts that are being advantaged by the new weights and by gaining taxing capacity, they're going to see that experience right away. Those being disadvantages are going to feel that impact right away too, unless it makes dramatic changes. What the law also did is it suspended the excess spending threshold language. So you don't have to worry about being double taxed over a certain amount at this point. It suspended the hold harmless provision that had been in equalized pupils, because we're not using equalized pupils any longer. And it suspended the ballot language for voting that had been in place. This is all done because it's going to be a significant change with the new pupil weights. And so the legislature is giving people time to kind of figure out what's going on and phase things in. That's also that 5% cap came in on tax rates. It's to give people who are disadvantaged time to adjust. And then there were additional specific supports besides that significantly large weight for EL, say English language kids, English language learners, pardon me. The thought was that these kids have a high cost, which they do, and that if you have a small population of 1 to 5, that the weights aren't going to really fully support the cost of those. There's an additional $25,000 grant that comes to you simply because you have between 1 and 5 English language kids, English learner kids. And if you have between 6 and 25, you get an additional $50,000, and that is on top of the weight that we had. And I think from there, we're headed on to Morgan.
Yeah, and so we're going to walk through what Brad just covered with some specific numbers, and we have 2 theoretical districts to show you. This first one is Mountain District. And first to walk through the tax rate calculation with numbers. In the budget year that we're in, the voters had approved a budget for FY24 that encompassed $15 million of education spending. So for Vermont, this is an average size district. They had 825 equalized pupils, which gave them a per pupil education spending of just over 18,000. That number is divided by the property yield, which is set by the legislature each year, to give them a homestead tax rate of just over $1.17. In the middle column, you can see the changes if Act 127 had been in place in FY24. So instead of equalized pupils, we're using that long-term weighted ADM, and they had 1,425 kids to count. This is because they had a lot of kids in poverty. It's a relatively sparse population and a number of small districts there. That would have given them a per pupil ed spending of $10,500 for that same amount of spending, and divided by what the property yield would have needed to be to accommodate all those extra pupils, their homestead tax rate would have been $1.08. Now, alternatively, Brad mentioned that the intent of the law was not to give districts like this the advantage to just drive down their tax rate. This district could have spent an additional $1.2 million that year if these weights had been in place, and they would have ended up at the same tax rate. And Chelsea, you can go to 18. Valley District is in a different position. Similar size, they had a $15 million ed spending amount in FY24, roughly the same number of equalized pupils, but under Act 127, their long-term ADM was not as high. They, like all the districts, have seen some increases, but it did not move as much as others. And so if Act 127 had been in place in FY24, their homestead tax rate would have been $1.37. And if they wanted to keep that same tax rate, they would have had to spend about $1.3 million less in Act 127. So it is going to be impacting even similar sized districts differently as this plays out. And then we're going to go through quickly some other impacts. Chelsea was talking at the beginning about some of the other factors that are moving. We can look here now, looking out to FY25 for the Mountain District. The census block grant, which is still being phased in, they're actually seeing more money from that in this slide, which is driving their education spending down. You can go to the next one, Chelsea. Inflation of 5% is going to drive that up a little bit. Then you go to the next one, and we'll see that they're going to be bringing in 2 positions from ESSER, which will add a little bit more to the tax rate. But what this shows is that with even with those changes, before they see what their new long-term weighted ADM number is, and before we know what the property yield is, for not really expanding any programs, they're already starting with a homestead tax rate that's a little bit lower than FY24. And if you go to 22, Chelsea, we'll see the same thing on Valley District. They're actually losing money in the census block grant, so that's a pressure putting them up. In the next slide, we see that inflation is impacting them as well. And I realize that a 5% inflation rate is sounds pretty optimistic given where salaries and health insurance are coming in. And then on the last slide, they're bringing in more positions from ESSER because they haven't done that in the past. So again, before any changes in ADM or any changes in the property yield, they're already looking at a pretty significant increase in their tax rate. And I know I'm flying through these, but I was told that we wanted to leave most of the session or half the session for questions. And then if you go to the next one.
Sorry, I was going to pause, Morgan, and just see if Brad had anything to weigh in on in any of those examples before we move on to this next part.
And you're muted.
I think the only thing I would say in there is that the yield has not been set yet. Morgan's showing a number of roughly $9,600 in there for FY25, and there's not been any recommendation, let alone set. There's not been any recommendation yet from the tax commissioner. By statute, the tax commissioner is going to make recommendations on December 1st as to what the homestead property yield would be, what the homestead income yield would be for those people paying based on their income, and what the non-homestead property tax rate was going to be. And those numbers are not yet available. So the number that you're seeing there for with Morgan should not be taken as what the yield is going to be, just a caution. We don't know what it's going to be yet. I do think it's going to be lower significantly than that 15,444. This is in that first column of Morgan's, because that's where we are under current law. But I think it's going to be less, largely because spending per pupil is going to go down, plus all these other factors Morgan is talking about. Again, as I said, the yield is set. I should say, the yield is set to bring in enough, both yields and the non-homestead property tax are set to bring in enough money into the education fund to support the school districts.
So Brad had talked about the throttle, the soft landing for districts that are seeing a decrease in tax capacity. And there are 2 numbers or 2 calculators here that are in play. And there's been a lot of confusion, I think, out there on which numbers are driving which percent. So for the first one, for any district, the increase in your homestead tax rate from 24 to 25 will be capped at 5%. That's whether you're gaining or losing capacity. That 5% will last up to 5 years. But if at any year you don't use it, you've come to your actual tax rate, that cap is no longer available to you going forward. So it's really in there meant to ease folks into that higher rate. There is a review process for districts that have an increase in their per pupil spending for more than 10% per year. So everybody gets the 5%. If your per pupil spending is going up 10%, there's a tax rate review process, a committee, and ultimately the secretary will determine whether that increase is justified or not. Districts that do not pass that process will lose that cap, and so they will move to their actual tax rate immediately that year. And obviously the tax rate review can't happen until after the budgets are passed. The last point on this is that for folks that have that capped tax rate, there's a certain amount of money in those towns that is not going to be raised because that real tax rate is not being applied to that grand list. The education fund is going to have to cover those costs or that loss of revenue. How it will do that is really up to the General Assembly. It could be applied to the non-homestead rate. It could be applied to the income sensitivity portion. It could go to the homestead rate for towns that are not capped, or the legislature could decide on pulling another revenue source into the ed fund in order to cover that. That's a legislative decision, and we're not going to know how much or where that money is coming from, at least for a while. And then if you go to slide 26, Chelsea, the two boxes in yellow are the two numbers that are going to be compared for the 5% cap. So it's your actual FY24 rate, the rate before the CLA that was approved by your voters, compared to the rate in FY25 that is also going to be approved to your voters. In this example, our Valley District, assuming they get the 5% cap, their tax rate that their voters are going to see is actually $1.31 or 20 cents lower than what their tax rate should be. And then if you go to the next slide, you'll see that the 10% figure is compared a little bit differently. So the ed spending for FY24 divided by that new denominator, the new long-term weighted average, gives you your base. And in this case, they are just over the 10% in Valley District. So they would need to go in front of this tax rate review process.
Okay, we're now going to move to the Q&A portion of this presentation. And we've got a pre-planned question for each of the panelists to prime the pump, as it were. So the first question is going to go to Neil Odell, past president for the Vermont School Boards Association. And it is asked from the perspective of a school board member. So Neil, for the school board members in the audience, what, in your view, are the key messages that school board members should share with their community in terms of the impact of the changes brought about by Act 127?
Thanks, Jeff. So I would say, as folks just heard, there are going to be a lot of districts around the state that might see increased taxing capacity with the result of this change in weights. And that would afford them the ability then to potentially add to their budget without substantially changing or increasing the tax rate. And I think the discussion that board members ought to have, amongst themselves and with their community members, ideally you've got a priority list already of things that, obviously would love to have included in the budget in years past, but were unable to. But, absent that priority list, a conversation with your community, with your administration, with your, building folks as to what are the priorities for the district, where should that money go, and how would you want to allocate it if you now have this capacity to do so. I would say on the flip side, there's certainly going to be a handful of districts where the change in pupil weights is going to result in a potential tax rate increase, even if we weren't looking at any increase in spending. And in those cases, community conversation about, do we need to cut the budget? Are folks willing to go with a higher tax rate? Weighing that against the priorities of the school district and trying to figure out, what's the best decision for budgeting under those circumstances. So I'd say those were the two primaries, Jeff.
Thank you, Neil. Now we'll turn to Brad James and Nicole Lee from the Agency of Education. They play a key role with regard to the administration of the education funding system. Brad and Nicole, from your vantage point, what do you think are the most important elements for board members to understand about the new weighting mechanism? You're muted, Brad.
There we go. Thank you. I'll just leave it unmuted now. I think, as Neil said, the main point that I see it is the intent was to be able to provide more money at roughly the same tax rate for these kids, these categories of students that gave you that additional taxing capacity. It's not really for a tax break for folks. You can get one, you can get both, but it's really truly to get more money for services for these kids. I think another one is that the intent of the 5% tax cap is, as Morgan correctly said and said quite well, it's largely to give the disadvantaged districts time to make their adjustments, and Neil had touched on that one also. I think two other points that are important is the yield is going to go down. It's going to change significantly. We don't know where it's going to be yet. And we're also, and this is where people have gotten confused in the last couple of weeks, is we're using a different pupil count. We're using the long-term weighted ADM as opposed to equalized pupils. So that in and of itself is going to be a change. It's, is it a significant change? Yes. And how it looks, is it working differently? Not really. What is working differently is for those districts that were disadvantaged by the old weighting system are now getting what they should have gotten years ago, probably under the new system with the new weighting categories and the new weights.
Thank you,
Nicole,
Brad.
did you want to add anything?
I'm just going to leave with what Brad said.
Thanks, Nicole. Okay, the next question is for Superintendent Bill Kimball. Bill, what are your strategies for the FY25 budgeting cycle? How are you working with your board to keep them informed with regard to what's to come?
Thanks, Jeff. We started actually about a month and a half ago here in Maple Run talking about the impacts of 127 without giving numbers. What I have found working with my board and with the general public and our staff, that going to numbers, we all kind of get fixated on the numbers, and it's more about the why. I think that's some work that we've done as superintendents in the Champlain Valley that's really helped me reconnect to the why. The slide that you presented earlier about the why from 127 is really critical when we work with our boards, because there's still work to be done to understand that we have a statewide funding system and a statewide responsibility for education, as you were addressing, Brad, about schools getting extra supports for the students that need it. And in our district, we started specifically in October with educating the board about 127 and a little bit of the mechanics behind it as well. And then we're using our same budget process that we've used for years here that's been successful in Maple Run and working with the board. And that is, at the beginning of November of every year, the board looks at budgetary factors and how much inflationary rates we should put to different parts of the budget. And the board approves those, and then we go develop a first draft of the budget. We'll be looking at that and how that impacts where we are versus the caps that Morgan spoke about, the 5% and the 10% weight pieces for Maple Run. And then I'm also at the same time educating our staff. I'll be doing one this afternoon with one of our elementary schools, explaining what's happening and how this is impacting the Maple Run piece. Then we're back to our traditional December, January timeline, and we're really holding from calculating numbers right now. I know, Morgan, you gave some examples of districts there, but in working with my chair, we've really decided that it's best not to put the numbers out yet until we get to the December 1 timeline of the tax commissioner's letter, because we could put something out erroneous that would get people either having joy or sorrow. And we really didn't want to do that. So it's been I will tell you in the background that my business manager and I are running some numbers based on some huge assumptions, but we could have those all turned around December 1st. So we just decided not to bring that data to the board until we get to our first meeting in December.
Great, thank you, Bill. Morgan, we're going to turn to you now in your capacity as the business manager for your supervisory union. How are the districts in your SU thinking about some of the uncertainties in the budgeting process brought about by Act 127? So that's the first part of the question. And the second is, what do you see as the biggest shifts that you will communicate with your board?
Yeah, I think the answer is very similar to what you just heard from Bill Kimball. Like in Bill's district, we've been communicating about Act 127 at a very high level for months, if not years now, to the boards, and just telling them in our two districts, we were always expecting that we would be gaining capacity. And so, not putting any numbers to it, but saying, prepare for that. As we go into this budget cycle, again, similar to Bill and Maple Run, I am not putting out any predictions in terms of the long-term weighted ADM or the property yield, because I know I don't have the first clue on where those numbers are going to end. In the past, we could kind of assume that equalized pupils weren't going to change too much from year to year, or we could look at our enrollment and have a pretty good idea of whether it was going to go up or down. I believe it's going to be a few more years before we kind of settle into a pattern with that. And again, as Brad said, the yield is likely to drop pretty precipitously, and none of us has any idea where that will go. Because of that, and this is something that we've been working with boards since as long as I've been doing this, we're trying to pull the focus more on the budget and the spending plan rather than the tax rates. And I've been telling them, let's focus on what you want to do with your budget. We will have time in late December, early January to adjust if we need to, depending on where those numbers fall down. And then what we really want to do is sort of be prepared for what this change in capacity might look to us. So the first numbers that my boards are going to see are going to be a lot higher than they've seen in the past. And the message I'm going to give to them is, this is very aspirational. We can always cut back from this if we need to in January when the yield drops and when the per pupil numbers drop, and we have those. And similarly, if I was in a district that was losing capacity, I wouldn't go in cutting a bunch of positions right away. I would go in with, here's the ideal spending plan that we would want. And if we need to cut, have a plan in the background about which positions or which programs are going to be impacted first.
Thank you, Morgan. So now I believe, Chelsea, the time has come to open the question and answer period up to typed questions in the chat. And I should have asked you this before we got started. Is the intent to just take them in order and go right through the list? Okay. So I'll do that without naming the person who has put the question in. I'll just read the question, and then we'll group source the answer based on the resource folks who we have with us as presenters today. So the first question that showed up is, where can I see the facility assessment for our district? Brad, I've got an answer to that, but I didn't know if you did as well.
I do not, Jeff. So if you have one, that's great. Okay.
So the Agency of Education is the entity that commissioned the assessments of school buildings in Vermont. Jill Briggs Campbell is the team leader on that. And there's a school facilities specialist, Bob Donahue, who was hired earlier this year to coordinate that process. Those facility assessments, when they are completed, are being sent to the school district superintendents themselves, And I believe they're going on a website at the Agency of Education. I don't have that website address with me, but in the post-session follow-up, we'll include that website along with any additional information about that assessment that's going to be helpful to you to navigate to it. So the assessments are available when they are completed, and there are some on the AOE website right now. So that's the response to that question. The next question is this: with respect to the triple E and pre-K weight of a negative 0.54, does this mean that pre-K students are no longer counted in school spending?
No. What we're doing is we're taking the negative 0.54 and using it as a weight. If you take an ADM times a negative 0.54, you get a weight of negative 0.54. When you add that back into the ADM, you get a pre-K ADM of 0.46. That is exactly what's happening right now under current law. It just looks different because it says under current law, you take that one ADM and multiply it by a reduction factor of 0.46. You get the same thing. Right now, under current law, it's being looked at, but under current law right now, pre-K and triple E students are being counted exactly the same way they have been in the past.
Right. And what I would add to that is that, and Brad, check me on this, it's the weight was established at 0.46 because it's a 10-hour per week obligation. And there is the omnibus early childhood legislation that passed has got a requirement for a review of that weight as we move forward. So I think as a community, we can anticipate action around that weight as we evolve toward the implementation of the early childhood legislation.
Yeah, I think that's accurate.
Okay. The next question is, how often and when are towns assessed to determine the appropriate weighting schema? Is this yearly, quarterly, etc.?
So I'm going to interpret that question as how often are weights calculated, or the student factors that go into the weights. The student counts that are used are taken in the fall census collections every year. So when you are seeing weights, what they are based on is the current year you're in. So this year, for FY25, the coming school year, they're based on this year's count and last year's count. They're averaged together, and then weights are applied after we added state place students. So the counts that are the base for all this happen every year based on the fall student censuses.
Okay. The next question's got some, it's long, but I'm going to read it. So it's this: one aim of Act 127 is to encourage supervisory unions and school districts to be mindful of increases in spending. A line item that AOE will consider regarding increases is healthcare benefits. Given that insurance premiums are set by VHI and Blue Cross Blue Shield, and the contractual benefits are negotiated by a commission created by statute, there is no local control over any increase in this line item. It is unfair to hold local school districts boards responsible for healthcare increases in their individual budgets, and to potentially punish them if part of an increase that might go over the 10% threshold is due to a financial matter wholly out of local board control. That's a statement. It's not a question, but I think that anybody who wants to comment on the statement should unmute and offer their reflections.
I think I'll go first, because that directly, my understanding, if I'm interpreting that question correctly, that goes directly to the tax rate reviews that are going to occur if your spending per pupil increases by 10% or more over the equivalent spending per pupil for FY24. The review committee is going to consist of 3 superintendents and 3 business managers. They will look at the information that a district has in terms of their budget They will be making recommendations to the secretary. I think it is well understood that certain things are completely out of your control, such as healthcare premiums and increases. And I do not think that is going to be a factor in terms of deciding that that's the sole reason as to why you went up and over the 10%. I think if that's the case, that it's not going to be, it's a no-brainer. It's like you have no control over that. Because what the law actually says, and I do have it buried here somewhere, is basically circumstances beyond, is this happening because of circumstances beyond your control? Healthcare increases are certainly beyond your control. So I don't think that's an issue.
Thanks, Brad. The next question is this. If a tax rate is lower, please expand, excuse me, if a tax rate is lower, please explain where you anticipate the money to achieve the full budget amount will come from. Ed fund, locally funded, etc.
So again, I'm going back to some of the things that Morgan was talking about. We're saying the tax rate is lower. I'm presuming that you're talking about a tax rate is calculated hypothetically at an 8% increase over FY24, but you're capped at 5%. So the question is, where is that 3% coming from, that lost tax rate revenue? That's coming from other districts, other taxpayers, homestead, non-homestead. That's what Morgan was talking about with the legislative decision. It was not discussed in the legislature as to how this is going to be handled in terms of where the money's going to come from. But basically, it's lost revenue to the education fund. However, the education fund statutorily is obligated to raise enough money to fund education in the state of Vermont. So if you're a school district that has an actual calculated tax rate increase of 8%, but you're capped at 5%, that loss of that 3%, whatever it translates out to be in terms of taxing capacity that's lost, is going to be made up somewhere in the education fund. It may be because the yield will be driven lower. It may be because the homestead property owners who pay based on their income will pay a little bit more. It may be because the non-homestead tax rate people will pay a little bit more. It may be you diving into the revenue or the surpluses in the education fund, if there are any. It may be the legislature coming up with new taxing revenue sources. Right now, we don't know, but it will be made up. It will be obligated. It is not going to fall on your towns specifically.
Just to follow Brad's explanation, which I thought was on point, yesterday we had occasion to work with a representative of the Joint Fiscal Office, and this particular question came up. And the response from the Joint Fiscal Office was that will be a policy decision. So in Brad's explanation, he talked about various sources of monies within the education fund. And it's not a given that there's going to be a direct correlation between property taxes paid per se and filling that gap that has been allowed by the cap on tax rates. I think realistically, it would be fair to assume that it will have some implication on tax rates, but I think it would be presumptuous to say that that it's a direct line and that the property taxes will be used to self-fund the money that's necessary to make up that gap, as it were. So simply stated, it will be a policy question that the General Assembly will contend with as it endeavors to set the yield before the conclusion of the 2024 legislative session. The next, go ahead.
Neil had his hand raised, so I just want to make sure there's nothing he wanted to add.
Sorry.
John.
Go ahead.
No, it's perfectly fine. Both Brett and Jeff addressed the question that I was going to raise in their response, so I'm good.
Okay. So the next question is this, and again, also there's a bit to this. There are questions all along the way, so let's unpack this one. So the number one question our board gets during budget season is, how will this budget affect my taxes? In years past, we could give them a rough estimate, but had to wait on the yield. This year, it feels like much more uncertainty, which seems like it makes it harder to answer this question. what sort of per district Act 127 estimate of impact is available for us to use when forecasting impact on taxes in our district? Can we pre-calculate the new pupil count? Do we know what new weights we are qualified for? What else?
I think it's important to remember that the schedule for these numbers has not changed. So we will still have a proposed yield rate from the tax commissioner on December 1st. By December 15th, we should know pretty accurately what our long-term weighted ADM is going to be for next year. We have always, at least most of us have always had to warn a budget and pass a budget and get through the reconsideration period before the legislature finalized the yield rate. I think what's different this year and where that uncertainty is that, we will have a tax commissioner letter on December 1. It will have a yield rate. And I think many of us will have less faith in that number than we've had in the past because of all these other factors that are going on there. Normally, when I talk to business managers across the state, we will use that commissioner's number in warning our budgets, and very few of us stray from that. In the past, when there has been uncertainty and the legislature has gone out early and floated a different yield number, some people have used that. But I think the mechanics of Act 127 really are no different than they were last year. Brad,
I would agree with what Morgan said. The mechanics really aren't different. There is more uncertainty because we're not sure what's going on. Right now, the yields and the non-homestead tax rate that's going to come out in the December 1 letter from the tax commissioner are based strictly on estimates because we don't know. As time progresses, and as you guys being the boards and the school districts have a better idea of what you now have a reasonable idea. Well, you have an idea of what the yields may be. Then what's going to happen is you're going to be building your budgets, and then once you have a board approved budget, we're going to be collecting. We being AOE are going to be collecting those preliminary budget data again, so that we have a better idea at that point. And this is the normal process. And at that point, we start going into House Ways and Means, which is where the yield bill starts. They're the taxing committee for the House. And we start presenting information as to what we've heard from board approved budgets. And that's where they start refining the yield. That process, it's an iterative process that goes on as we get more and more information. They get a tighter and tighter idea of what the yield is going to be. Right now, though, as Morgan said, there's more uncertainty at this point for the December 1 recommendation of the tax commissioner than there has been in years past because of the uncertainties of what's happening. We don't know how people are going to react to this yet.
And Brad, can I just jump in? So am I correct, Brad, in that the AOE has shared with business managers already what those new pupil counts will potentially look like?
We not know because we're just getting that data now. Okay. What we have shared is a template where it said, here's what we know. Again, remember, the pupil counts are 2-year average. Here's what we know for last year. You guys have a better idea of what we do right now for this current year. So you can plug in your numbers and that will kind of spit out, here's roughly where you're probably going to be. So there's a template that gave them a pretty good idea that Nicole did.
Yep. So board members, if they wanted to, could check with business administrators because they've got some figures that can help in budgeting already.
And additionally, while you mentioned that, Neil, what Nicole also sent out was we reworked FY24 pupil counts under the new weighting system. So we know what the FY24 long-term weighted ADM counts are. We recalculated FY24 education spending per recalculated long-term weighted ADM counts so that you know where your equivalent FY24 spending per pupil is that you're going to compare to your FY25 for that 10% potential tax rate review. So that's out there too.
Okay. Anybody want to add anything to this element of the conversation so far? Okay. We're gonna go to the next question. So, this is it. When Brad states the yield is going down, is that due to everyone having more pupils or the additional spending across the state? If it goes down due to the pupil counts going up, that causes significant confusion.
It's going to go down for both reasons. Remember, your spending per your tax rate, your homestead tax rate is based on a spending per pupil. All else being the same, no changes anywhere, keeping the yield where it is, whatever. You're spending the same, but instead of using equalized pupils, we're using long-term weighted ADM. That's a larger denominator. You're dividing the same number by a larger denominator. Therefore, your spending per pupil is going down. If you divide that by the same property yield, your tax rate is going down also. The problem with that sounds great on the surface. The problem with that is it does not raise enough money for the education fund. So what has to happen, because you have a lower spending per pupil, the yield has to go down also in order to bring the tax rates back up to where they fully fund the education fund the way they're supposed to. Add to that now, you are now changing the numerator, which is your education spending, because spending is going up. Then if your spending goes up, your per pupil cost goes up, therefore your tax rate goes up. So it's going to be a function of both.
Anybody want to add to that? Okay. If that's not clear to people based on Brad's explanation, add it to the questions and we'll come back to it, because I think it's a critical piece and it takes a little bit of time to wrap your head around. But let's create some space by going to other questions. And then if that comes back up in terms of, I still don't understand that, it needs more clarity, then we'll come back to it.
And it's very understandable if you don't.
Right. So the next question is, do you know why the legislature does not allow districts who get the merger grant due to a voluntary merger to take advantage of the weights? This feels punitive for a district that voluntarily merged. And then there's a reference to law. Payment of a merger support grant under this section shall not be made in any year that the school district receives a small school weight under section 4010 of this title.
So I want to flip the question around. The question was stated as merger. You don't get if you get a merger support grant, you don't get the advantage of the weights. It's actually the opposite. If you are a school district that gets the advantage of a small school weight, you don't get the merger support grant, because the legislature made the decision that if you got both, you're double dipping. And so what they decided that the one that would lead the charge would be the pupil weighting, because it's a pupil weighting bill, I guess. But if you get a small school's weight, you don't get your merger support grant. If 1 year you don't get the weight, if 1 year you get the small school grant, let me start again. If 1 year you get the small school weight, you don't get the merger support grant, and then the next year, for some reason, you don't get the small school weight, you get the merger support grant. You get one or the other, but it's dependent on whether you get the small school weight.
Okay. Next question. What information is the state using to identify where students fall in the new weighting system? Example, how are you identifying poverty students?
We as the state are not necessarily identifying the poverty students or economic disadvantage or deprived or whatever the terminology is people prefer to use. That's coming from the districts, is coming in through the census collections. And it's basically based on some type of measure with the federal poverty level. If you are a child who lives with a family that's at 185% of the federal poverty level, then you are tagged as being eligible for this weight. A lot of it comes from free and reduced lunch. A lot of it comes from direct certification from the I never remember the term categorized to schools. The schools that basically they get most of their kids are allowed to get free and reduced lunches. There's Medicaid certification for school districts who are in the National School Reduced School Lunch or School Lunch Program. It's those things. There was the new household income form in statute. It was called Universal Income Declaration or Universal Income. Yeah, Universal Income Declaration, I believe, which is a new form that the Agency of Education was charged with putting out. They came out, they called it the household income form. And that is my understanding is it's less intrusive than what the federal folks are requiring for school lunch. But basically it's asking what category of income is your family coming into. So that's another way that we're getting that information back. It was sent out to the schools that are the approved independent schools where you tuition students. It went out to all the districts. So it's coming from a multitude of sources is what it's doing. And what our data team is doing is collecting all that information as it comes in, making sure there are no duplicates in there. And then those are the data that we're using. But basically it's come from the school districts and the reporting.
Okay. The next question is, can you elaborate on the tax commissioner letter coming out on December 1st?
At this point, no. And the reason I'm saying no is because a number of people in the background are working on estimates. And so one group is doing this, one group is doing that, one group is doing the other thing. It's when they all come together that there's going to be some type of idea, and that's going to be the December 1 letter. Up until then, nobody really has any idea.
Let's assume that the questioner and they might know what the purpose of the December 1 tax commissioner letter is. But if they don't, Brad, would you just give us the high level overview of what that December 1 letter is intended to accomplish?
Sure. What that December 1 letter is intended to accomplish is to figure out the pieces that have to come out there to fill the education fund. If you think of the education fund, it's meant to fund basically everything that you guys are doing. That's what it's doing. And you can think of it in three big parts. You can think of it as the non-property taxes, which would be sales and use, purchase and use, meals and rooms, lottery transfer, Medicaid, a smorgasbord of things that grow by roughly a certain percentage each year. It's changed a little bit because of, the sales and use of meals and rooms lately. But those are kind of a known quantity coming in. There's still, so if the ed fund is this big, I'm trying to get my hands in the picture. If the ed fund is this big and they fill this much of it, there's still this whole piece here that needs to be filled. That comes from non-homestead property taxes, and that comes from homestead property taxes, either by people pay the full homestead property tax or they pay based on their income a reduced property tax. What the December 1 letter is going to do is set the parameters for those latter three. It's based on estimates that we think are going to be happening, what the education fund is going to be needing, and what the sources are coming in. And what it's going to do is it's going to set the non-homestead property tax rate. It's going to set the property yield, which is your spending per pupil divided by the yield gets you your tax rate. And it's going to set the income yield, which is, again, a little more involved, but it's basically 2% of your income times a certain percentage. And that's what household income people pay. It's a little more complex than that, but that's generally the idea. So what the tax commissioner has to do is it's he right now, he has to look at the average tax rate increase in those three categories, and they have to be the same percentage increase. That's what the tax commissioner has to do, and that's what the tax rate letter on December 1 is going to do. It's going to make those recommendations, so they will be the starting point for when you're starting to look at the tax rates that your proposed budgets may ultimately end up in. Was that clear? I'm off the top of my head, clearly.
Chelsea.
I just want to add, we in this webinar have assumed a certain level of understanding about the education funding system in general. And with the resources post webinar, Debbie at the VSB and I will work together to also send some basic resources about the education funding system for those that maybe are a little bit newer at understanding some of this vocabulary and how it functions.
Thank you, Chelsea. Okay, so now we'll go to the next question, which is, what about districts that are disadvantaged in both categories and are going to have to reduce offerings significantly just to maintain the tax rate? How can we judge what a 9.9% or lower increase is if variables won't be known until after the January ballot date, or in some cases after the March election?
So I think at least in the second part of that question, you will have the data you need to determine your per pupil spending increase by December 15th. Your business office should be able to come up with a pretty close estimate in terms of your number of your pupils, your long-term weighted ADM, but by December 15th, you'll have a solid number. And then that and the budget that you're taking to voters are the only two numbers you need to determine whether you're under that 10%.
Right. And then determine the tax rate itself is not going to be, again, as Morgan said earlier, it's not going to be different than what it's really been. Again, there's a little more uncertainty to it this year. I agree with that, but it's going to be the same time concept. Once we AOE hears board approved budgets, we start talking to Ways and Means. That's when you start getting a better idea of what the yield is going to be. But for the time being, people will probably be largely using those yields in the December 1 letter.
Okay. Next question. We are a district that is due to benefit from the implementation of weights. By converting FY24 equalized pupils to long-term weighted average daily membership, decreasing the amount we spend per weighted student, and holding us to the 10% cap, it would seem to negate the possibility of increasing tax capacity in our district. Can someone speak to this?
Yeah, I think what the questioner is maybe confusing. I could be wrong, so correct me if I'm wrong, questioner. Is confusing is that you're looking at what your spending per pupil is under the current law versus what it will be next year in FY25 using a different pupil count, a much larger pupil count. What you need to recall is that the law says that we, AOE, are to recalculate your spending per pupil FY24, not using equalized pupils, but taking those same student counts that gave you the FY24 equalized pupils, running them through the new weighting formula, and coming up with a new long-term weighted ADM for FY24 using the new weighting system. And it's that spending per pupil versus that pupil count that is going to be your mark for going forward to FY25 to turn it to 10%. So it's more or less an apples to apples type comparison that you're going to be seeing.
And I think it's also important to remember that the 10% cap is really only relevant if your tax rate is going to be capped at 5%. So I know I did some modeling in my two districts, both of which are benefiting from the new weights. And again, I'm using ADM numbers that aren't out yet, and this yield rate that was, maybe relevant for last year, but we don't know where that's going to end. So given that, I said, okay, if both my districts, if their per pupil costs go up 10%, what is that going to mean to their tax rate? And one was still going to see a tax rate decrease, and the other one was going to go up by maybe 1% or 1.5%. So I think if you're benefiting from the weights, as we said before, you'll have the information you need for that 10% cap, but it may be totally irrelevant to you.
Okay, thank you. Next question. It seems that any district would be really wise to develop two budgets at the same time, since having to cut anything out later after the yield is announced is going to be heart-wrenching. I think I heard this recommended, but is this actually what the panelists are recommending?
Can I talk to that, Jeff?
You can.
I actually recommend not to do that. I can tell you that in talking with my colleague superintendents, we're a district that actually is going to see a decrease in our tax capacity as we're modeling it right now. But I've instructed my principals to build a level service budget, which means, try to build for the same things we have right now. If you need something different in configurations, tell me where the reductions will be. That's been pretty standard protocol in my 10 years or so as being a superintendent. So we're building pretty much the same and waiting to see what the impacts are, because I want to be able to educate the board about if we need to make reductions, what are the things that we're going to be reducing to make 10% cap or 5% cap, because we're definitely somewhere in that area for Maple Run. So I've heard similarly from many superintendents about the same type of instructions that I'm giving at this point to the buildings and helping us build a district budget. And so we're only building one budget right now.
Thank you, Bill.
Jeff, I would add to that as well too. I would say something similar in my district as well too. So it was part of our budget committee met, back in August, early September to develop budget guidelines for the administration. And part of that was to develop a single budget, but also at the same time to consider, if cuts might need to be made later on in the process, to have administration consider where they might come from. So certainly not part of the original budget, but we also didn't want folks scrambling at the 11th hour to figure out, where cuts might need to come from if we anticipate that they might be a potential.
Okay. I'm going to combine the next two questions because the first one is a little cryptic and the second one gets into at least the special ed category. EDs. And the next one was, if we correct our FY23 data that was used to calculate our long-term weighted ADM, will our FY25 census block grant be recalculated, or will this only affect the year after?
Let me think about that for a second, because that's a me question. We put out the FY24 grant. I'm ignoring while I think for out loud for a moment. In FY23, we calculated what the census block grant was for people based on statutory information. We then calculated what the target block was going to be in FY27. And then what the law said to do was you go from FY23 to the FY27 in quarterly increments, either up or down. Okay, equal increments for those 4 years. So we know basically what the census block grant per ADM itself is going to be. What the law then goes on to say is that for each year you get the amount of that census block grant per your 3-year average ADM, the most recent 3 years. So if you have an FY23 ADM count that's in the FY24 census block grant amount, not the grant itself, not the census block grant per pupil, but the total amount, it's a certain amount. Then in FY25, that number's been revised, that can change the total amount, but the census block grant per ADM itself will not change. The total amount may, all else being considered. Or equal, I should say, not considered.
Thank you, Brad.
That's a challenging question.
So the next question, Brad, I think you can take a little breather. And I think Neil, Bill, and Morgan are probably the best to wrap their heads around this one. The question is, how are you all talking about the relationship between the new weights and the ending of ESSER funds? It's not just that many communities face a loss in taxing capacity. Many are facing the loss of funding for positions created with ESSER monies. anyone have a good way of explaining the relationship between these two as we talk with our communities and boards?
I can take a stab at it and I'll let Neil and Morgan jump in. We've actually been talking with our board in our community since the beginning of ESSER about not trying to have a cliff at the end of this. We have some positions that are cliff, but we're also going back to what our we call them objectives and key results are. They're part of our planning process through the ESSER planning strategic plan that was required for ESSER. And so we're talking about how we're moving forward and what's happening with students. We're actually in December 1st doing student data presentation at the same time as the budget to look at what are our needs via the long-term strategic plan that's sunsetting with ESSER. And so that will be part of what we're talking about in the budget. And I think we also have to be able to talk about in the budget with the reduction of ESSER, but also with the shifts, as I said, Maple Run, we'll see reduction in tax capacity. So we have to talk about what aren't we funding in the budget and how, just today, I just came from a meeting with my whole leadership team talking about, we were looking at our budget and then saying, how does this align with our objectives in our strategic plan? So where in the budget, if we know those cost centers, and do we want to keep those going? Because it may take a few years to see the data results change for the students.
Thank you, Bill. Morgan or Neil, do you want to add anything to that? If not, we can keep going.
I would say, Bill's response was sort of spot on. I guess in a perfect world, maybe when we initially spent those ESSER funds, we tried to do it in a way that didn't set us up for a cliff, but we certainly understand that, the situation was what it was at the time, and we needed to do the best that we could as boards and administration. Stick with your strategic plan, stick with your district priorities, use those to drive the decisions on how you're going to get through these things and for those community conversations.
Morgan, I see you nodding your head. Let me ask the panelists, are you able to hang on for 10 minutes to extend this to 1:40 in an effort to get questions answered real time, verbally, rather than have to rely on written word? Okay. Thank you very much. So I'm gonna combine the next two also. So the first question is,
I'll just quickly add logistically as we're getting to 1:30. If you asked a question and it's not been answered, we are recording this. So you're welcome, if your time doesn't permit you to stay on longer, to go back and listen to the responses to those questions.
Okay. So the first question is, what will happen to tax rates when the 5% cap expires? And a related question is, can you provide more information about the dynamics of the 5-year phase-in? On what schedule and in what manner will the new weights be applied? Thank you.
Well, I'll start with the last. Go ahead, Morgan. You be my guest.
I was going to say, on the first part, on what will happen when the cap expires, I think the real answer is it depends on what you do in the next 5 years. And it's really there for a soft landing. And if you don't take any steps to land, there is going to be a cliff at the end of those 5 years when that cap goes, and you may see a pretty significant spike to your tax rate. Again, the intention behind it is to give you those 5 years to adjust your spending, and certainly there's lots of other things that are going to change over those 5 years. Most significantly, pupil counts.
Okay.
And then in terms of schedules, in terms of the schedules that are being applied, it's going to start. It's starting. We're about to do it, as Morgan's been saying. We're going to have the data in December. We're going to be doing it. Numbers will be coming out. So it's happening. It's happening in 4 weeks, roughly.
Yeah.
And so beyond.
Yeah. What I would say is, so I come from one of those districts that's about to see a a sizable potential increase in our tax rate. And I just wanted to alert folks to two things. If they weren't obvious, one is that 5% cap is getting applied to the tax rate prior to the application of your CLA, so before the common level of appraisal. And then Morgan is right, like for those districts that are in the situation where you're likely to see an increase in the tax rate, do your best to try to do some forward forecasting of these things, because at the end of that 5-year period, you could see, we were just talking about the ESSER cliff. There could be another cliff for those districts that are coming up in 5 years related to this cap going away for you. So I would caution districts that are in that situation to do the best that they can, work with your BAs to do some future forecasting on this if you can, because it could hurt.
Okay. Thank you, everyone. Next question. How confident is the AOE that it has accurate data to appropriately calculate the weights for socioeconomics?
I would say we're as confident as we've ever been before. Before, the information that we got came from the Department for Children and Families. It was basically a count from their field representatives of students ages 6 through 17 living with families who are receiving some nutritional benefit. So it was a black box to us. I had to trust their word. I had no way of checking it. This way, it's being reported by the districts. So it's I think you folks have a better understunderstanding of it than I do. One of the big discussion points that came up initially when when Act 127 was first being discussed in the legislature was that the poverty counts were too low. And that they were not accurate, and so the legislature changed it. Do I have confidence in it? I probably have more confidence that these numbers are better economically disadvantaged counts than what we got from the data from DCF.
Thanks, Brad. The next question might be hard to respond to because we're not sure exactly which budget webinar is referenced, but Neil, perhaps you will know. Says, would you recommend that new board members view the budget webinar that the VSBA did a few years ago?
Can I just make a recommendation that Debbie and I will put our heads together and get the most accurate and recent resources that would be, and we'll make it very clear in the email. Sorry, I don't mean to cut you off, Neil. If you know that webinar is really great and recommend it, please feel free to do so. I just don't know which ones are which at this point.
No, I agree with you, Chelsea. If you and Debbie can work on that, because I do believe we have a couple of them out there. And so I want to make sure that we've got the best material for members. So yeah, if you could do that review, that would be perfect.
Got it. Okay, thanks. Will the estimated tax rate income sensitivity document traditionally shared with business managers to inform the public be substantially modified this year?
Well, that's a good question, and that is up to the tax commissioner as to how he wants to write it. My guess is that you will see the same type of, he basically had 3 or 4 blocks of information. You'll probably see those, but then the dialogue or the explanation that goes with it, the potential, if this happens, then that happens, that changes every year. So I think the format will generally be the same. I think you'll see the numbers that he's recommending, that it's, there's this, compared to what's happening now currently, this current year, and then the explanation is going to be open to whatever he wants to say.
Got it. Thank you. We're going to move fairly rapidly now. Next question. To oversimplify this, if the total dollar amount spent on education is increasing, regardless of all these factors and calculations, the cost to taxpayers will increase somewhere, correct? I would say the answer to that question is yes.
Yes.
Okay. Next question. Am I understanding things correctly that districts that have increased student counts due to the new weighting from Act 127 should see an increase in tax revenue? However, it also sounds like due to the prediction that the overall yield may be lower, districts with higher numbers of weighted students may end up with lower tax revenues as opposed to the old per pupil funding system. Brad, that's a complicated question, but I think you're the best person to answer.
Yeah, I think, tax revenue is how much is raised. And that depends on what your tax rate is and what your grand list is. Let's assume the grand list isn't changing, okay, that we know what it is. What's going to happen with Act 60, Act 127 with the new weights for a district that's advantaged by this is that their spending per pupil is going to be going down relative to what it was if you put things on the same equalized basis. And so that gives them additional taxing capacity to raise more revenues to provide services to these kids. That basically gave them that taxing capacity. So the tax revenues themselves are not what all school districts are getting. You're not fully funded from tax revenues. There's the whole rest of the education funds. So some towns, again, you have to differentiate between school districts and towns. School districts operate schools, they educate the kids. They're the ones developing the budget. They're the ones that require the money. They also create a homestead property tax rate that gets passed on to the member towns. And it is the towns that raise the property taxes. Those property tax dollars, contrary to how the system works, are state education fund money and should all go to the Treasury for deposit into the education fund. They don't. Because what the legislature, and this is an artifact from Act 60 when they had the old prebate checks that were physically mailed out, if people remember that. What happens is there are two pots of money in a town now that are state education money, homestead property taxes and non-homestead property taxes. And what the law tells us to do is to say, look at the school districts that these towns belong to, or school district singular, these towns belong to. And it says, the school district needs this much money from this town. You have this much state money here, your homestead property taxes, send it to your school district. School district now needs less money because it just got a whole bunch of homestead property taxes. And then the law says for us to look at, it says, okay, what's the school district still need? It still needs more money. Here's this other pot of money that the town has, this non-homestead property tax. And if you need more, you send it all there. If the town was able to raise more than it is required to send to the school districts because it is a strong grand list, it sends part of those non-homestead taxes to the school district. The school district is now whole, filled with state money. The town is still holding on to some state money, and that goes directly to the education fund to be sent back out along with the non-property taxes. So I think looking at tax revenue, that's how you're being funded, is not the right way to look at it. School districts get funded from the education fund completely. Towns raise state education tax dollars, either directly or indirectly, send them to the education fund. But it's not just tax revenue. That was probably more than you needed to hear. But
Brad, we're going to go to the next question. Which, if you can answer it succinctly, please do. Otherwise, it lends itself to further resource. So, question is, would you please explain again how the additional funds grant is calculated for districts with certain number of ELL students?
The EL student grant? Okay,
Yeah.
Sure. Yeah. If first of all, you get the weight per EL student. Okay, everybody gets that. If you're a school district that has between 1 and 5 EL students, you get an additional $25,000. If you are a school district that has between 6 and 25 EL students, you get an additional $50,000. If you're 26 or more, the assumption, I guess, is that the weights will cover that additional cost that you're incurring.
Okay, I'm going to take the next question, and this is offered in all sincerity, so it may sound like, I'm being curt, but I'm not. So the first part was, how does the state determine the total amount of funding sufficient for all educational services in Vermont? The answer is they don't. It's a locally determined amount based on the school boards working with administration staff as to what amount of money is necessary in order to meet the goals and objectives for students in that community. The second part of that question is, will Vermont factor in the need for any more resources for mental health specialists and academic interventionists as ESSER funds end. If we use history as our guide, school districts have long been making an appeal to the state for resources necessary to pick up the mental health burden in general terms. So the answer to that question is, one might hope that they will account for the increasing demands on schools as society grows more complex and changes. But there's no sure thing that they will. I think that the weights were intended to address, in quote, societal needs in general. But if you speak with school officials, I think they always talk about the compelling need for more resources and lament the fact that those resources both don't materialize necessarily, and that there seems not always to be the appreciation of the role that schools are playing in meeting societal needs. And then the second part is, how will Act 127 take into account the funds our board pays for students' tuition out to high schools operated by other districts? Brad, I'm going to look to you for that response.
Basically, the tuition you pay to another school for, because you don't operate that grade, is part of your budget, and therefore it's part of your education spending. So you're getting the weights for whatever those kids are who are going, because they're your residents. So you get the weight, but you also have, because you have the cost. So it's just, it's just part of your education spend. It's no different than it is right now. It's just that the weighting system itself is changing.
Okay, the next question, Brad, is, does Act 127 speak to a preferred way to do SU assessments to each district? My understanding is that the law used to tell an SU to use either equalized pupil counts or ADM, or agree on a different formula. Since there are no more equalized pupil counts, is there a change?
Actually, what the law says is, and it hasn't changed, is the district or the SUs are to use enrollment counts, which is still there. But I don't know of any SUs that do that. Usually they have some different agreement, but there was no contemplation, no discussion, no change in the law about how SUs can make their assessments. There's the default language and statute of using the enrollments for your districts, but it's still open to agreement of anything else. Morgan and Neil can probably address that too.
Okay.
Yeah, I don't know about any changes in the law. We certainly use enrollment in ours.
Okay, so now what I'd like to do is avail myself of Morgan's goodwill. I'm going to jump to the last question. And Morgan, if you are able to read the second to the last question, which is the anonymous attendee question, just wrap your head around that, and we'll go to you last to answer that one. So the last question, other than a comment on the webinar, is this: for those districts planning a major capital improvement project with a bond that may be approved in March 2024, will the impact of the annual bond payments be included in the tax rate decrease calculation? Any thoughts on how the committee might view this scenario if the increase is over 10%, or with some or all of that increase caused by a bond payment on a large project? My response to that is that you're going to have an opportunity to present your case to the tax rate review committee. And if they determine that the project has merit in the context of the responsibilities of the school district to plan, prepare, and administer the budget properly, then it goes back, I think, to the earlier counsel that was granted by respondents, which is, in effect, you'll be making the presentation to 3 superintendents and 3 business managers. They're going to be advising the secretary on what's reasonable. And if it's reasonable to be improving your capital infrastructure in the manner that you did, it seems like, and we can't predict, but it seems like you'd get a favorable recommendation with respect to that cost. Anybody have a different view on that?
No, I would just add that if a bond is approved in March of 2024, it probably will not be in the FY25 budget, and you're not paying for it until you start doing that first principal interest payment, which would probably be in FY26 would be my guess.
Right. I think that is true, and the overall sentiment would still apply.
Yes.
Morgan,
yes.
you want to take a crack at that last question, and then we'll thank folks for being with us today.
Sure. Do you want me to read it?
We'll have some final words.
Do you want me to read it?
Sure.
So it asks, I may have missed this in conversations about the facilities assessments earlier, but what about considerations for small districts that have debt service because they have fixed up their facilities with approved bonds, therefore having less deferred maintenance and likely to get less support in the future from any avenue of facilities funding, but they are locked into the debt in their regular budgets for a number of years, thus giving them less wiggle room to decrease an overall budget. This could be a driver in why a small district that has done this has a higher ed spending per pupil than others. So I would say that the answer is very similar to the one that we just had. I think that's a legitimate case to make to a tax review committee if you are going in front of a tax review committee. If you have a higher ed spending already, the benefit is that 10% is worth more when you go in terms of what kind of impact it has on your increase. In terms of the question about them less likely to get any support in the future from expanded school construction, Jeff, you may have an opinion on that, but I think that's sort of just the reality that we've been working in over the last 15 years is we've been moving forward knowing that it was maybe out there, but having to make decisions that were right for our districts today.
Right. I don't have anything to add to that. I want to turn to Chelsea to bring us home. Thank you, Chelsea.
Yeah, I just want to say a sincere thank you to all of our panelists that helped to inform this process and gave us their valuable time today. And I want to thank you all for joining us. As a follow-up, again, there will be a recording available on the VSBA website. And we will also send resources along that we promised along the way, which is the basics of the education funding system, as well as more information about the facilities assessment. If we miss anything, please feel free to reach out to me or Carrie at the VSBA. Again, thank you so much for being here.
And I would add, finally, I just thought of this, Chelsea, that's why this is a process by which your associations and our friends in state government are working to make sure that you have the information you need. So this, Neil mentioned at the outset, we had done workshops at our conference. We have this webinar today. VASBO and VSA are working with school business managers and superintendents specifically in early December, and Act 127 implementation will be a part of that. We know that both the AOE and the legislature itself is working on resources to help foster a strong understanding of the effects of Act 127. So this is by no means the last you'll hear from us on this. And anyone who's on a webinar, whether they're business managers, superintendents, or school board members, should be encouraged to reach out to your own associations if you need additional support with the navigation of this new and important law. So thank you very much.